All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the JC Syndicated Podcast. This is episode number 004, and we have an amazing guest today. Before we get to him, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Ranger Essentials Coffee Company. Fueling your mission one bold cup at a time, whether you're in the field, at the office, or burning the midnight oil. Ranger Essentials delivers premium, mission-ready coffee inspired by the grit and resilience of Robert Rogers himself. Visit rangeressentialscoffee.com and use the code JC Podcast for 15% off your first order. Stay sharp and stay essential. Ladies and gentlemen, we have another great guest on today. I've known this gentleman for a while now, and I just have to say he has an amazing backstory, and so I had to get him on the podcast, and that gentleman's name is Don Bentley. Welcome. We're going to go over your website here. I just want everybody to check out Don Bentley. Is it donbentley.com, correct?
Don Bentley Books.
donbentley.com. Gotcha. All right, Don, welcome to the JC Syndicated Podcast. Your episode number 004.
Man, 4, that's a lot to live up to, but I'll try my best. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, we're really honored to have you because for those of you who don't know Don, he's a best-selling author. He writes for Jack Ryan. He writes for Vince Flynn. And I'm going to go ahead and just read his bio for people who are already tuned in on who Don is. So Don Bentley is the New York Times Bestselling author of the Matt Drake series, Forgotten War 2023, and 4 Tom Clancy Jack Ryan Jr. novels, Weapons Grade 2023, and the Vince Flynn Mitch Rapp series 2024. He spent a decade as an Army Apache helicopter pilot, and while deployed in Afghanistan was awarded the Bronze Star Medal and the Air Medal with V device for valor. Following his time in the military, Don worked as an FBI special agent focusing on foreign intelligence and counterintelligence, and was a special weapons and tactics SWAT team member. Don lives with his family in Austin, Texas. So again, welcome, Don Bentley.
Thank you.
So Don, just, in the tone of JC Syndicated, I really want to just kind of jump in and learn about you as an individual and learn about your background, what kind of drove you to where you are today. And so if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to just begin kind of with your childhood. Tell us where you grew up, the town you grew up in, high school, all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So my wife and I are high school sweethearts. We've been in Texas for, I think the first time we came, I was stationed at Fort Hood back in 2001. And so have lived north of Austin for the last 12 years. So I think we're officially Texans forever now, but we both grew up in the Midwest in Ohio, actually, in a town midway between Cincinnati and Dayton. In fact, I spent my kindergarten through 8th grade years in a tiny town called Reading. And I don't know that Reading has a whole lot of claim to fame other than if you're familiar with J.D. Vance's autobiography, Hillbilly Elegy, which is a phenomenal book. He grew up in Middletown, and Reading was just next to Middletown. In fact, we played them in football and such. So very similar, another little tiny town. And then my freshman year in high school, we moved to a bigger one and met my wife in high school, and then went to The Ohio State University on a Army ROTC scholarship where I studied electrical engineering, as all good writers do, and then spent 10 years in the Army. So, yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. So I did get an opportunity to go up to Ohio State and speak at their ROTC program. And so
that's awesome. I didn't know
I'm familiar. Yeah, I'm familiar with the area. Not as familiar as you are, but I was wondering how you got into the military. And so that explains a lot of that. So what was your experience with Ohio State? Did you enjoy your time while you were there and significant?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, it's a big school, and so it helps to have a community that makes a big school a smaller one. When I think the biggest school in the nation now might be A&M, but at the time that I went back in 92 to 97, I think Ohio State was the biggest or one of the biggest. And so I was fortunate enough that a good part of my community came from my ROTC buddies. In fact, a number of us are still on a chat group now, whatever, 27 years later or something. several of those guys, one of my classmates and really good friends actually made general, and a couple of the guys ahead of me did as well. So I think Ohio State did pretty good from that regard. But it was a great program, fantastic folks to work with, and a good introduction to the Army. I mean, I wasn't an academy guy like some of the folks I'm sure you interview, and I think maybe being an ROTC gives you a little bit of the best of both worlds, because you get to have a normal college experience and then still get your familiarization with the Army and then get commissioned afterwards.
I think so. If I could go back, I would probably choose to go maybe the ROTC route.
Yeah.
And I personally, I loved Columbus. I thought it had a real interesting feel to it. It kind of reminded me of a little bit of a European layout to it. Meets kind of a San Francisco, the downtown part, the old part.
Yeah, a lot of that's all new now. So when I was there, especially around campus, it was majority High Street was kind of the main drag, and it was just a lot of seedy bars, and they have done a ton of renovation there. I actually got to go speak at they have the Veterans Museum there in Columbus with a guy named Alan Mack, who you should have on your podcast too.
Mm-hmm.
He's a phenomenal guy, was spent the majority, if not all his career in the 1st and actually flew the original horse soldiers into Afghanistan. And so he had a book come out, his autobiography, which I think is called Razor 7, which was his call sign. And so we both got to go to that phenomenal museum there in Columbus. It's a really, really nice area. Like you said, it's a nice place to raise a family or go to college for sure.
I think so, yeah. It seemed like tech was really ramping up there too when I was there. And I actually did get an opportunity to go by the museum with General Fair. And they did a really good job, I thought. So,
yeah, it's phenomenal.
That's amazing that, so I forget how old JD Vance is. I mean, he's a little bit younger than we are, so probably you never ended up playing him in football or anything. But you probably know some of the same people that he knows, I would assume, maybe if you go back far enough. I also think it's amazing what you just mentioned about the ROTC programs, because some of the things that they mention to you, like in basic, and, you kind of brush it off, is like, they'll say like, the guys next to you, to your left and to your right, some of these people you're going to know for the rest of your life. And when it's right in front of you, you don't think, I mean, a few years, down the line, you think is forever away. You don't think about 27 years. So for you to be saying that you're on a group chat, and I have these same type friends, it's just incredible to me that, that people maintain these relationships and that those bonds are formed.
Yeah, it's even more than that. So ROTC has this thing, at Ohio State, it was called Ranger Force. I can't remember what it's called in other things. And what it used to be at Ohio State, so cadets used to be able to go to Ranger School instead of going to the advanced course. And so many cadets failed out of Ranger School that they quit doing that because, as Ranger School and being a Ranger in general is super rigorous, but they kept that little, it was a separate company within your ROTC company. And so you'd spend, if you wanted to be part of Ranger Force, you spent a quarter sort of half pledging it, and there were all these physical events that you had to do, ruck marches and learning the Ranger Creed and learning the knots and everything. And my Ranger buddy in ROTC was a guy named Doug Peluso. And one of my fondest memories is the two of us in the front leaning rest getting yelled at by the first sergeant, who was the Ranger Force first sergeant at the time, for messing up the Ranger Creed, and we're both reciting it as we're doing push-ups. And so fast forward to 2005, that probably would have been 1996, and all three of us were in Afghanistan together. And so I was actually, Doug Peluso then was a Green Beret team leader. I'm actually in Afghanistan. Every time a new special operations team would come into theater, we'd take them across the river in Bagram and shoot for them. And so they get used to doing close combat attacks. And so I was shooting for this Green Beret team, and that's like, man, the voice on that radio sounds familiar. And Doug's like, Don, is that you? And so he ends up coming over to my B HUD afterwards. And then another guy that was the Ranger Force commander at the time, Bill Hannon, that ended up going to Ranger School and was a combat engineer. He's the guy of us that's a general now, was in Afghanistan. And so we, I think, all watched the Ohio State-Michigan game together. And so it really is surreal. Like you said, the military is a smaller community. than you think it is. And those bonds that you form, whether it's in basic training and ROTC and the service academies, they really do stay with you for the rest of your life. And those guys, I was actually just texting with Doug a week or so ago, and we're all still on group chats together. So it is pretty neat.
That's crazy. And it's got to be kind of fun for them to know that they, were close friends and buddies with the guy who ended up being a best-selling author. That's got to be a little bit of a brag book right there for him.
It's funny. Doug Peluso's been in several of my books, and so I keep making him characters in a book. So in my book that just came out in September, my first Vince Flynn book called Capture or Kill, there's a scene in Afghanistan where this ODA team is working with the Ranger Regiment to do a hit on the compound, and the ODA team sergeant is Doug Peluso. And so I put a lot of my friends in my books. The fourth book in my Matt Drake series is called Forgotten War, and Doug's in that one too. I think Paul Crum, who ended up being a nurse, who was the first sergeant yelling at us at the time. I think I put him in several of the books too. So it's fun. If you're friends with an author, you might end up in a book and you might end up dead several times, because I can bring him back and then kill him again later.
Yeah. I got 2 letters for JC in the next book.
There might be a young Ranger named JC in the next book. We'll have to see.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Well, so this is so when did you, I guess, obviously you graduated, you went to the unit, you trained, I mean, everybody, it's Fort Rucker, right? I mean, you went to Fort Rucker.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and then you selected towards the end, if I understand, like you figure out basically, or they figure out what you're going to fly.
There's an order of, there's an order of merit list. And so it's, you're constantly all through flight school, getting grades, and part of it's how you fly. Part of it's once you finish flight school, you go through the officer basic part of flight school, where you actually learn like the military decision-making process and how to write op orders and kind of all that officer stuff. And you get graded throughout all of that. And so I think it's in that you figure out what you're going to fly. And so it's kind of where you are on the OML list and the needs of the Army. And if those two things align, you get to fly what you want. And so I was fortunate that I'd worked really hard in flight school, and then also they needed a crap ton of Apache pilots at the time, and I desperately wanted to fly Apaches. And so that worked out pretty well for me.
What time frame are we talking about here?
Yeah, so it would have been, I was commissioned in 97, but I had to wait. So funny military story is I was commissioned in 97, graduated in June. And then, my wife and I had dated all through college. We're going to get married on the 5th of July. And my original report date was supposed to be 6th July. And nice. So I went in, great way to start your marriage. And so, later I would have known that nobody would have been there, right? Because they would have all been on the 4th of July holiday. So we would have gotten there. It would have been fine anyway, maybe. But I went into the ROTC admin folks and I said, look, and this was probably 3 months before I graduated. And I said, look, I'm getting married. Is there any way you can push the date back? And they said, we'll ask. And so 2 weeks before I'm supposed to graduate, they call me in and they say, hey, we got good news. We got your class date pushed back to the 28th. And I'm thinking, oh, the 28th of July, that's fantastic. And they said, no, the 28th of November. And so it's like 2 weeks before I'm supposed to graduate. I've got no job. My date just got pushed back by 4 months and stuff. And so I didn't end up going to flight school until November. So this probably would have been sometime in 98. Flight school with your, so once you finish flight school and you finish the OBC part, then you go to what's called the Aircraft Qualification Course, the AQC. And that's where you fly. Back when I went through, you did not fly your aircraft until then. Now they've moved that, they changed it up a little bit so you get more hours on the aircraft in flight school instead of just doing the AQC. And so the Apache has, at the time, I think it still does, the longest AQC. So for instance, the Black Hawk one is only 6 weeks because the missions that you fly as a Black Hawk pilot are certainly can be very, very complex, but the aircraft itself is much simpler to fly, where the Apache, there's a couple things. So number one, you fly using the infrared system that sits on the nose of the helicopter. And so you have what's called the helmet display unit that goes over your eye, and where your head moves, that sensor moves. And so when I went through, you didn't fly with goggles at all in the Apache. Now they've changed that up, and usually one of the pilots will be up goggles and the other will be up system, because of the different spectrums. Like on a high illumination night, the goggles are going to be much better than the system is. And all the guys on the ground using their laser pointers and stuff, you can't see that under the system, but you can see it under goggles. But when I went through, they didn't. Lots of stuff changed in 20 years of combat, as you well know. And so the Apache qualification course, I think, was right at 5 months or something like that, because you had to learn how to fly the helicopter. You had to learn how to fly the helicopter under system, which is called fly in the bag. And then you had to learn how to employ all the weapon systems. And so it was a much more complex aircraft, and it took much longer to learn how to fly. And so I think I got to my first duty assignment, which was in 16 Cab, and then Wonju, South Korea. I don't think that post exists anymore. I think they closed it down, but it was right around April of 99 or something. And so from November of 97 to April or so of 99, that's how long it took to go through flight school and the officer basic course.
So two questions for you right off the top. And I guess I'll ask this one first. This is like, while you're going through, I know you said you did well in flight school. So all along the way, have you come up against any moments or times where, you thought this is a little harder than I expected, or was it fairly easy for you? Did you breeze through? I mean, let's talk about like the physical aspect, physical assessment, all those types of things. Like, did you get to a point where you were missing, like your wife and saying like, I don't know if this is for me, or were you just the whole time were you like, I'm going to get this over with, I'm rock rolling?
Yeah. So the good thing about the aviation officer basic course in flight school is because it's so long, it's a PCS move, where most of the officer training programs, because they're shorter, are TDYs. And so you could bring your wife, and I brought mine to Fort Rucker because it was a PCS move. So that part was great. Okay. Flight school was incredibly stressful, and I did well overall. I was not by any means a natural pilot. And so I remember listening to Dale Stark, who's an A-10 pilot. He was talking about the Air Force flight school, and he said, you're always 3 check rides away from going home. And that was the same in Army flight school, because what would happen is they don't ever adjust the standards for where you are, meaning that if you hover, the standard for hovering is, I don't know, you're allowed to drift 5 feet and your heading has to be within 2 degrees or something like that, whatever it is, right? So the first time you hover, you fail it, right? Because you've never done it before. And so the way the grade sheet works, and they call them horse blankets, is it would have these lists of maneuvers, and then on top, a number of hours by which you were supposed to have obtained a passing grade on that, right? So say hovering, you got 10 hours to be able to perform satisfactory. So the first time you did it, you get a U, and unsatisfactory, you'd fail. But it didn't count until you reached that 10-hour mark. And then on the 10th hour, if you didn't hover correctly, you got a U, and you could get what's called a progress ride. And if you failed that too, you'd get extra hours. And if you failed that, you could be done with flight school. And so you were always under this stress where, I can't do it. Oh my God, like tomorrow is the 10-hour mark and I still have never gotten this maneuver right. And then most of the time it seemed like magically you could do it right when it counted, and there were more hours. The second part of flight school is much that's stressful, is that there's a huge amount of memorization that has to go through it. And so there are 2 chapters called Chapter 5 and Chapter 9. And those are the emergency procedures and your limits. And so you had to have both of those chapters memorized verbatim. And so every class, the flight instructor would just pick random students, and they'd ask you a question, and you'd have to stand up. And if it was out of Chapter 5 and 9 and you messed it up, you automatically failed that day. And so the same thing if you got so many fails in a row, then you're done. And so I actually I was really, really good at being able to memorize stuff. Like I could do that. And a lot of times that's what saved me, because the way the instructors looked at it is that there's nothing that you can do on your own to become a better pilot, right? You can't take the Apache for a spin after class, but you can work on your memorization stuff. And so you would see in flight school, they would sell these little like flip cards, all these index cards that were spiral bound together. And so you could tell if somebody was a flight student because over lunch, everybody would be flipping through these things. If you walked by their car, they'd be sitting there flipping through these things, constantly trying to memorize it. And so I figured, when I was having problems flying, sometimes the parts that would save me is I would always nail my EPs and limits, or I would have the stuff memorized, and the instructor's like, okay, this guy's working hard. He's not where he needs to be from a flying perspective, but he's doing what he can for that work. And so I actually had to, when I was flying, so your first phase is called primary, and that's where you learn how to just, fly the helicopter. It's in the daytime. The next phase is instruments, where you learn how to fly in the clouds and fly instruments. The third phase was called basic combat skills, and that's where you're actually learning how to navigate on a map that you couldn't use GPS or anything like that. You're literally, they would tell you before the flight, we're going to go to this LZ, this LZ, this LZ. You'd have to plot it out on your map, take into account the winds, draw a little azimuth, and then fly and navigate. And you'd start higher, and then as you progress, they'd lower you closer and closer to the trees so that you would have fewer and fewer terrain features to be able to associate with, right? And so what you're literally doing is doing time distance heading, trying to account for the winds as you're doing it. You had this little, they called it a computer, but it was really just this little wheel that was a slide rule, and you'd put the winds in and turn it and try and figure out what heading. And it was, for me, the guys the guys that did better on it were the prior service. Like my stick buddy was the prior service infantry guy, so he could land navigate like a son of a gun. And so it wasn't as hard for him to go from land navigation to helicopter. In fact, there are times where I'd get lost and he'd be in the back seat trying to tap me on the shoulder and being like, it's over here, it's over here. And so that was really hard for me. And then and that's also where you learn how to, like, the fundamentals of reconnaissance, how to actually use terrain masking, how to fly the helicopter tactically. And then from there, you go to night. And so that's the first time you fly night vision goggles. And so you do everything you did in basic combat skill, but now at night. So now you have a little lip light, and you have your map, and you're trying to look at your map and then look outside with goggles and everything like that. And thought I was nights were super hard for me because you're navigating and it's pitch black and you're looking at a timer over here, the heading over here, trying to figure out what the wind is, looking outside with your goggles, trying to associate that with the map. And I thought I was going to fail that tech ride, and then it all came together at the end and I graduated. And then with the Apache, though, flying the bag, where you're flying the system with just that one eye. And so you're using one eye to look inside, look at the instruments and stuff. You're using the other eye to fly out. I had a hard time with that. And I actually had a prog ride and got extra hours and had to go back a class and keep going. But it's not uncommon in the Apache, but the whole time in flight school, there gets to be a point. It is not, like I said, it is nothing like Ranger School or any of the schools in the military that are super, physically wear you down to the point where you're like, what am I even doing here? I hate every day. Flight school is nothing like that. But it's certainly like 3/4 of the way through, you're like, this isn't fun anymore. I'm stressed all the time. I'm spending every minute of every day either memorizing EPs and limits, or you could do this thing called chair flying, where you would plan out the mission and you would sit in a chair and think of how you were going to fly each step of the mission, when you were going to turn the radios, and to try and visualize it before you actually flew the mission itself. And when you weren't flying, you were studying. On the weekends, you were often studying. You were always, at least I was, like I said, I certainly wasn't a natural pilot. You always felt like you were 2 days from getting a bad grade and going home. Gosh, on Tuesday, I have to be able to do this auto return, and I haven't been able to get it right yet. And so it was stressful in a certainly a completely different way than a lot of the more physical MOSs were, but it was certainly pretty stressful. And so I would not ever want to go back and do flight school again. That's for sure.
Yeah, it seems, I mean, I could see how it's stressful in a different way. Like you said,
Yeah.
It's not, if they're not trying to grind you down, it's still mentally exhausting.
Yeah.
And then the pressure of like, if you don't pass, you got to do something else. And then just the other stuff of like, being embarrassed or whatever it is. The other question that I had for you while you were there was, did you bring pizza or peanut butter and jelly or potato chips to the Ranger School graduates, or excuse me, the Ranger School students in Florida phase?
So those are only the Blackhawk guys.
Okay. So you have an excuse. You have an excuse.
So, no, we never, though I think now, so we never did any joint stuff with Ranger School students, but I think they do that more now, maybe even the Apaches and stuff to do it, because it does make sense. And everything, there's the original guys and girls who went into Afghanistan during the initial invasion from an Apache perspective were the 101st folks. And they're in the book, Not a Good Day to Die. There's this great scene where they did not realize that they couldn't hover. And so up until that point, everything Apache, because the Apache was designed in the Cold War to be able to hang back in the Fulda Gap as the Russians are coming through and lob hellfires and rockets and 30 millimeter from 4 or 5 or 6 Ks away. And then fast forward. And so the old Cobra guys and girls who flew those gunships knew how to do diving fire, but Apaches had never done that. And so they literally were learning on the fly as they're getting shot at in Afghanistan. And so people got smart pretty quickly about joint stuff and how to integrate with guys and girls on the ground. We used to have this cheat sheet in Afghanistan that was just a close combat attack, a CCA card that we just hand people. And like, here are the 3 things you got to do. You got to come up to my frequency. You got to tell me where you are. You got to tell me where the bad guys are. Like all the other sexy JTAC stuff, you don't need to do that. Just these 3 things are what. And so we practice, like what I said before with Doug's team, we practiced a whole lot more. And I think folks are much, much smarter with that now, when I was a young lieutenant, especially in my first duty assignment as a cavalry squadron, we didn't really interact with the guys on the ground at all, because our mission in Korea was twofold. So when the war first kicked off, the North Koreans had these crazy little speedboats or hovercrafts that they would pile full of special operators and then send them screaming down the coastline. And they were too fast for the Navy ships to be able to catch and too small for fast movers to be able to shoot up. And so somebody had the idea, well, we'll send Apaches after them. And so we would practice that for the first week of the war. And in Korea, you would practice going to war 2 or 3 times a year. There would be these huge exercises. And so the first week you'd fly over water and you'd work with the Navy Blackhawks. They called them lamps birds. And so they would vector you onto targets. And then the second half of the war, once the artillery battle was over, because the first half of the war, the North Koreans and South Koreans and Americans are trying to establish dominance with artillery, is that you would go north across what's called the forward line of troops, the SWAT, and you would go deep into North Korea to hunt for the second echelon forces. And so you would kill those motorized rifle brigades as they were coming down to reinforce the front lines. And so that's what you practiced over and over again, is doing reconnaissance and movements to contacts. And I was the scout platoon leader. And so you had to memorize the enemy order of battle and say, okay, this is not the target I'm looking for. These are artillery pieces, or this is the Advon main body. What I'm looking for is this. And so you would get quizzed on that, right? Like that goes again back to when you come to a unit, what's different in flight school. So as an infantry officer, when you come to a unit, you usually have like a ranger tab or something to say, hey, I'm new, but I have done this thing that affords me a certain amount of respect for the men and now women that I get to lead, right? As a lieutenant, as an aviation officer, you're the most junior guy or girl in that unit. You barely know how to fly, but you're supposed to lead the men and women who have, countless years in flying experience under you. And so again, another way that you can demonstrate that competency is being in the books all the time, understanding tactics, understanding the EPs and limits, knowing that stuff. Because again, the only thing that makes you a better pilot is flying more, but you, especially as an officer, as a commissioned officer, you needed to be to show that you were willing. And so as a young scout platoon leader, I got Top Gun. And the reason why my backseater and I earned Top Gun wasn't because I was the best pilot in the world, is because I was constantly on the little simulator practicing over and over and over and over and over again, because that was the thing that I could control, and I wanted to be worthy of the men and women that I got to lead, even though I was the junior most pilot, right? And so that's one of the ways that you can earn credibility in that unit, even as a super young officer. And so there was a tremendous amount of learning that you had to do, and Korea at the time was a great place to be a junior officer because it was the closest pre-2001. It was the closest thing to, quote unquote combat, because there was a real enemy across the line. In fact, at one point, the North Korean and South Korean navies were shooting at each other and sinking each other's boats, and we actually broke out our war stock and were throwing hellfires on the helicopters and thought we were going, and then they de-escalated it again. But you got to know your job really, really quickly. And because it's Korea and you're separated, they kind of jam 3 years worth of a tour into that single year. And so it was a great experience as a new leader, but I really didn't integrate with ground forces until somewhat through my second tour of duty, because I don't know if it still exists or not, but for a time I went from a CAV unit to 4th Infantry Division, and they had an element called the Brigade Reconnaissance Team. And so their job was to go out, and a lot of them were CAV scouts, a lot of them were, artillery guys and everything, and their job was to go out and find targets. And so we worked with them a little bit, but honestly, it wasn't until kind of Afghanistan and the run up to that where you're thinking, okay, so the mission has changed now, and what I'm primarily going to be doing is supporting guys and girls on the ground and doing close combat attacks and stuff like that, as opposed to, it's one of the big differences between Army aviation and any other aviation, even Marine aviation, is that Army aviation is a separate branch because we have a mission that's independent of any other branch. Like going back to what I said before, when we were the Brigade Reconnaissance, we were the brigade commander's eyes and ears, right? And so you would go out. The Army treated Apache helicopters like they were flying tanks. And so you learned how to, what the fundamentals of a reconnaissance were, how to do an area or a zone or route reconnaissance, how to do all of these things that's independent with the guys on the ground, because aviation is a separate branch, as opposed to kind of the Marine Corps, for instance. Aviation exists to support the guys and girls on the ground. And with the Army, it's a little bit different. And so it took some getting used to, for sure, when we went to Afghanistan.
What time frame was it when you did go to Afghanistan?
2005 to 2006. So
okay.
I only did the one time. So yeah, 2005 to 2006.
Yeah. And I mean, for you, what was that deployment like? How long was the deployment for?
It was a year long. I would say that I had it probably the best time to be in Afghanistan from like a creature comforts and everything perspective. Like, I did not have it rough. We lived in bee huts. It was before McChrystal came along and tore down everything that soldiers. And so literally when I left in Bagram, I spent the majority of my time in Bagram. I did go to, I had folks in Salerno and Organy and Kandahar, and Jalalabad. And so I did spend time in each of those, but I spent a lot of time in Bagram. And when I left, like in Bagram, there was a Dairy Queen, a Burger King, all of the, and so from a creature comforts perspective, it was certainly not bad at all. Now, the folks who were out in the more like Salerno, Jalalabad, Organy, stuff like that, that was certainly a lot different than when I had it. And then after I left, when McChrystal came in, I can't remember when that was, like in the 2007 or 8 or something like that. I know he went through like a wrecking ball and tore all of that stuff out again. So I have friends of mine that went in during the initial invasion, or even in 2002 and 2003, they were still taking a shower out of their canteen cup or something like that. That certainly wasn't my experience.
So what months were you there in 2005? Because we probably crossed over. I was there 05, 06 also.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I probably saw you in the walking around in the PX or something. So you could always see the cool guys because they had pockets up here or pockets here on their side that they'd sewn on, and all kinds of stuff on their rifles that I didn't know what that did. So I was there. I think we got there maybe in February of 2005.
Yeah.
So we would have left. I left a little bit early. Like I left I had been a troop commander for a little over 2 years. And so I changed command in Afghanistan. And so there really wasn't a job for me to do. So I went into the S3, the operations shop. And I forget what the title was I had there, but I ended up going home a couple weeks before the rest of the squadron to do the advon stuff and everything, get everybody else ready to come home. I think maybe we went in March and I came back in February the next year, something like that.
Got it. Yeah, we definitely crossed over for sure. I guess, so your experience in Afghanistan, any touch and go situations for you, or, any times where you thought, hey, I might not make it out of here, anything like that?
Yeah, so I'd say that 95% of my missions were pretty boring, and so I was the headquarters troop commander. So in an aviation cavalry unit, because I was there with 2-6 Cavalry, there are 5 troops, and 3 of those are what's called line troops that have the helicopters. And so when we went to Afghanistan, it was a cavalry squadron that had all Apaches and a Black Hawk battalion, and then a company of Chinooks. And so they task organized them, and we had company plus or troop plus in Bagram, a troop in Salerno, and then another troop plus in Kandahar, and that troop belonged to the Black Hawk battalion. And so the Black Hawk battalion gave us a couple companies of their Black Hawks, and so they task organized them apart. And so I was the headquarters troop and commander, which means that I didn't have any helicopters. So I had the fuelers, all the staff people, the motor pool folks, all of that. And so I was a pilot in command. I'd actually made pilot in command when we were at Fort Hood during the train up. And that's a big distinction. So pilot in command means that you can fly. I guess the best way to put it is you are the pilot of that helicopter, right? If you're not a pilot in command, you have to fly with a pilot in command. And so in aviation, in Army aviation, the majority of the pilots in commands are warrant officers, because so in an aviation troop or company, there's 1 captain, there's 2 lieutenants, one is the scout platoon leader and one is the attack platoon leader. And then the rest of the pilots, which are maybe 20, something like that, I can't remember, are all warrant officers. And so as a commissioned officer at the time, you had to work really, really hard to become a pilot in command, because it was traditionally a warrant officer job. You didn't get as much flight time, because in between being a platoon leader and before you were a company or troop commander, you worked on staff, and so your hours went way down. And so all of that to say, because I was a pilot in command, my best friend was the line troop commander, Bravo Troop Plus. And so when he would go out to do a bunch of the sexy missions, he would use me to be kind of a replacement crew. And so I would pick up in Afghanistan. There were usually 3 types of operations. So the one was the ring route, and those were super boring usually, but super long. And so you'd fly maybe for 8 hours, and your job was to escort a Black Hawk or a Chinook as it went around Afghanistan, dropping off soldiers, or, they used to call them like the ash and trash missions, right? That's where you're doing logistics stuff. Those were usually pretty boring, but had a lot of flight time. On the opposite side of the scale was the direct action mission. And so if you were going in Afghanistan, it was pretty unique, because in normal Army, like you were a special operations guy in the Ranger Regiment, conventional aviation like me wouldn't usually support you, because you have like the 160th and they fly their DAPs and their little birds and all of that stuff. And so the SEALs, Rangers, Green Berets, all the folks in the special operations community, typically when you guys got close air support, it would either be ANs or it would be the 160th from the Army side, or maybe AC-130s or something for the Air Force side. When I was in Afghanistan, it was different because the 160th Little Bird, their typical gunships, couldn't fly at those altitudes because it was so high in Afghanistan. And all their DAPs, their Blackhawks that have that 30 millimeter chain gun and the rocket pods and the Hellfires and all stuff, were all in Iraq for the most part, supporting the mission there. So we got to do a lot more of the operations with. I never did one with the Ranger Regiment, but I did several with the SEALs, or what we call direct action missions, right? Meaning that a team, sometimes special operations, sometimes conventional infantry. I did one that it was actually the DEA was the lead entity, and then there was a battalion of Afghan ANA folks, and we went to go hit a drug lab. And so you're going outside the wire to hit a target, and we as the Apaches would provide escort to that target, and then once the guys got on the ground on the objective, we transferred to close combat attacks and doing that. And so I didn't do too many of those because, again, those were the sexier kind of varsity crew folks that would do that, though I did do some down in Jalalabad and that DEA mission, and I think a couple others. And then there's the in-between where that's called the QRF, or the Quick Reactionary Force mission. And so every day there had to be 2 Apaches and 2 Blackhawks, and I think 1 or 2 Chinooks, but 2 Apaches that were the 911 force for Bagram. And so your job, you'd work a 12-hour shift, and you'd carry a little walkie-talkie. And if that walkie-talkie went off, you had to be airborne within 30 minutes. And so the majority of those missions too were still pretty tame. A lot of times it would be a medevac was going out into a hot LZ, and so they needed an Apache to escort them, or maybe a general's flying to Kabul, and so there's going to be an Apache. But every now and then you would get one that were called TICs, or troops in contact, where somebody is in trouble and they're just calling, and so the Apaches would get released from Bagram to go support that operation. And so my touch and go day, or I guess my worst day, was on June 28th, 2005, where I was on QRF duty that day. And so the way it starts is you get an in-brief when you come in that morning, and they say, hey, here's the S2, or the intelligence guy or girl gives you, here's what the tactical situation looks like. And then the S3, or the operations officer, gets up and says, here's a list of the possible missions that are going to go on today. And that morning when we came in, and it's usually really, shift change is really early. Like, I think it might have been something like 4 a.m. or something like that. You'd work 4 a.m. till 4 p.m. And I think the reasoning for that is because they always wanted you to have some daylight and then some night, kind of that overlap. And so you would typically get up, at 3 or 3:30 in the morning, go run the helicopter up, make sure everything worked. If it didn't, you'd bump to another helicopter, run that up, and then you'd come into the TALC, or the Tactical Operations Center, for the brief of that day. And so that morning, the F3 said, hey, there was a 4-man SEAL team that the 160th inserted the night before, and we lost communications with them. So don't know what that's going to mean, or what that means for you guys specifically, but here's kind of what's going on. And it may have been more in-depth than that, but I didn't pay too much attention to it at the time, just because you got briefed a lot of things that never happened, or never would happen, where you would come in and say, hey, this, or maybe there was a tick going on over here, or this other thing. And because you were the only 2 Apaches that were operational for Bagram, it took a lot to get you released to go do a mission, because and I don't even know if you had release authority. It might have been the brigade commander, it might have been higher than that, because in their mind, if they give up those Apaches and then the Taliban makes a run on Bagram, or another one we would do all the time is when Bagram would get rocketed, you'd fly out to the point of origin and see if you could find who was shooting at you, stuff like that. And so I don't remember too much more of that than that. And then that morning, maybe an hour or two later, my radio went off. And so I went running for the helicopter, and my front seater was a fantastic guy. Actually, when we left Afghanistan, he was a young captain named Alex Brown. We flew together quite a bit because he was the S1. So he had already been a platoon leader. He was a captain, but hadn't been a commander yet. And so he was working at the S1. And so we would fly together all the time. And he had been a lacrosse player in in college. Super great guy. When we left Afghanistan, he actually left aviation, went to selection, became a Green Beret, and finished his Army career as a team leader in 10th Special Forces Group. And so he went running up to the talk. I got the helicopter going, and he came down and jumped in the front seat. And he said, "Hey, it's that SEAL team. They're being overrun." And here, I think at the time, all we had was a grid coordinate, a call sign, and a radio frequency. And that was all we knew. And so we took off. It was me. And then my wingman was my XO, a guy, captain named Dan Bryce. And then Mark Rudy was the pilot in command of that bird. He was a maintenance officer, another stud, great pilot. And so the two of us flew from Bagram down to Jalalabad, where we picked up two Black Hawks that were full of Marines, the Marine Quick Reactionary Force. They're in Jalalabad, and I forget which infantry battalion it was, but there was a Marine battalion that we supported all the time, because it just so happened that when we rotated into country, the Cobras that had been supporting the Marine infantry stationed at Jalalabad rotated out, and so we picked up that mission. So we worked with them quite a bit too, and so whole bunch of Marine infantry on these two Black Hawks, and we just took off for this grid coordinate, and that was all we knew. And so what we were going to try and do is establish contact with the SEALs, figure out where we could put the Marines down in an LZ, and then hopefully transition to doing close combat attacks and get them out of there. And so it was really, really high, and that was a problem for us because we were the first longbows into Afghanistan, and so we were much heavier than the old Alpha models, but we had the same engines. And so in the summertime, so this is June, if you're high, hot, and heavy, you have performance issues, because what happens is that to keep the engines from overheating, there's a what's called a engine control unit, digital engine control unit, that meters the flow of fuel into that engine, I guess sort of like a carburetor. And so if the engine temperatures get too hot, it shuts down the amount of fuel that flows into the engine, which means that you don't generate enough to continue to get the rotor blades to spin, and so the rotor blades spool down, and so you can crash. And so what you had to do was adjust your airspeed, and so we're flying really, really slow as we're trying to get up to this mountain, to the point where I had to tell the Blackhawks to slow down for me because they were flying to the LZ faster than we could get there. And so when you fly an escort, the helicopters that you're escorting are in front and the Apaches are in back. And that's so if they get shot at, you can roll in on whoever's shooting them and suppress them. But there's a point called the release point that's a couple kilometers away from the landing zone, where you change positions and the Apaches go on ahead, because your job is to clear that landing zone, and you call it either ice or cherry. It's either a hot landing zone is cherry, ice is a cold landing zone. And so then you clear the Blackhawks in, and if necessary, you can provide suppressive fire and stuff. And so as we're getting there, I had to keep telling the Blackhawks to slow down because they were leaving us. And so as we're approaching the last known point and trying to call these SEALs on the radio, I see two 160th Chinooks, the Army, the Night Stalkers coming in, and you could always tell it was a 160th Chinook because they have this massive fuel probe on the front that normal Chinooks don't. And so I see them slide into formation, and there was actually an A-10 or two overhead too at the time, and I can't remember how we got a hold of them, whether we were able to get them on the same channel or we had to have the A-10 who had their frequency talk to them. Because if I remember correctly, so in military radio, you have a thing that's called a fill, which is kind of the cryptology that allows you to talk secure And you can have different units that have different fills. And so even if you're on the same frequency, if you don't have the same fills, you can't talk to each other. And so I can't remember if the A-10 had to link us up or something, but somehow we figured out that they were, I think also the frequency that we were calling the SEALs on, the 4-man SEAL team we were trying to find, the SEALs in that Chinook were also using to try and call their buddies. Because I remember Alex, my front seater, actually talking to one of the SEALs in the Chinooks. And so we figured out that they were full of SEALs too. And so as we're getting closer to the objective, the Chinooks are just leaving us behind. And so we called them on the radio and said, listen, you have to slow down or you're going to get to that landing zone before we are, and we're not going to be able to clear it. And the pilot for that Chinook came back on the radio and he said, negative, we're going in. You can clear the landing zone once you get there. And then that was the last transmission that I ever heard that they made, because then the next one I heard, I think, was from the A-10, and he said, the MH is down, the MH is down, the MH is down. He was talking about the MH pulling up. And so I didn't see what was happening or what happened because I was in the middle of passing the Blackhawks at that time to try and get to the landing zone. But apparently as soon as he came to a hover, he got hit by an RPG and went down the side of the mountain and crashed into it. And so when he did that, the A-10, one or both of them, rolled in and started shooting white phosphorus rockets on either side of the crash site. And I believe their reasoning was that they were trying to keep the Taliban off the crash site. But if they cleared that through us, I certainly don't remember that radio call. And so from my perspective, all I could see was everything on fire. As the operation happened, I was trying to pass the Blackhawk, and so I went one way, my wingman went another. We almost had a midair, and it was just a train wreck. And so I just remember having that moment of thinking, like, this is really happening. Like, I'm living Black Hawk Down now, and I can't believe this just happened. And so, yeah, that was probably the worst day. Was the most SEALs in the history of the SEALs died on that day until the extortion shoot down that tragically happened a couple years later. So, like I said, 95% of it was pretty boring, but that one day definitely made up for the rest of it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's probably pretty common for a lot of people. And for those the audience that's listening that doesn't know what that is, it's obviously the lone survivor Operation Red Wings mission with Marcus Luttrell, where he was lost and everything. So yeah, that's amazing that you were part of that. And I mean, I can't imagine being a part of it and being kind of in your shoes and seeing all of that's pretty extraordinary. I mean, that's probably as hairy as it gets, I would say. So it doesn't really, you don't need a lot of those days, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So that had to have like an effect on you. But what I want to get into is like your time in the military and then transitioning and your exit from the military, because we have a little bit to get into here. I want to talk about, so like you transitioning out of the military and then the decision to step into, FBI and what that process kind of looked like, and maybe you could take us down that path.
Yeah. So after leaving the Army, after spending 10 years and doing the tour in Afghanistan, I actually went and worked a civilian job in a great company, but couldn't figure out why I wasn't happy there. And so what I tell folks that come out of the military is that you don't realize how much of who you are is tied up in what you do until you aren't doing that thing anymore. Like, I defined myself as a gunship pilot. That wasn't what I did. That was who I was. And then when I wasn't that anymore, I had a really hard time adjusting to that. And I think the second part was that operation that we talked about, when it went so tragically wrong and so many people died and you're still left alive, you have this feeling that you have to do something with your life that atones for that, or that makes up for the fact that you're still there and these people aren't, and there has to be a reason for it. And so how do you do something that's significant enough that it means something And so those are really weighty things and really hard to figure out. And so for the 3 years when I got out of the Army, even though my wife and I moved back to our hometown and my parents were there and hers were there and I had a great job, I just couldn't figure out why everybody was happy but me. Everybody else was fulfilled but me, with me, and I couldn't figure out why. And so at the time, what I tell people now is that you have this bucket when you're in the military, especially if you deployed to combat, that is your identity, your sense of purpose, this feeling that what you do is noble, the camaraderie you get from the men and some women that you serve with. And then when you leave, you have to figure out, it's usually not one bucket that satisfies all those things again, right? Maybe part of that bucket is you volunteer at your church or something. Part of that bucket is you have a job. And so for me, at the time, the FBI had this program where they were actively recruiting folks who had combat experience, who had been in the military. And so I'd always thought of the FBI as police officers. And I'm like, I don't have any desire to do that. But once there are actually 5 different, there may be more than that now, but when I was an FBI agent, there were 5 different specialties. And so there was criminal, counterintelligence, intelligence, counterterrorism, or cyber. And so once I realized there were other things that I could do in the FBI that more closely aligned with the things that I did in the military, the things that I got satisfaction from, went through the application process and was selected and got to go be an agent in Dallas and made the SWAT team there. And so that was much closer towards kind of filling those buckets and that sense of purpose and camaraderie, and that what I was doing was noble and mattered again than my original job when I got out as a civilian. And that's why I think one of the programs, like I said, the military's gotten really a whole lot smarter after 20 years in combat, is they have that really neat skill bridge program now that allows service members in terminal leave to go do an internship, for lack of a better term, at a company. And it maybe gives them a better sense of whether it's a good fit for them, whether that transition, because most of the folks that were you and my generation, most of those people did not stay with the first company that they went to after they got out of the Army or military. And it wasn't because that company was bad. It was because they had to figure out kind of that equation that we just talked about. How much of your satisfaction are you going to get from your job versus where you volunteer versus something else? And that was certainly the case for me.
Well, and also, like you said, I mean, at the time, so when I ETS, it was like, late into 2006, and so this process, it wasn't for a while until the civilian sector even kind of realized what was going on with veterans exiting the military, and then like how do they mesh with them, and like you said, skill bridge. So I was at a point where I got out and I'm like, I don't need any help. I don't need anything. And I found myself in a situation where I kind of was it was all discovery learning. Yeah. And it wasn't fun. And so I agree with you that skill bridge, I think, is amazing, because a lot of times, I think the stable environment for a veteran, like you said, like you may not be happy in the position you're at, but I can tell you this, that there's some things that can make or break that transition period. Yeah. And employment's one of them. I mean, having an income, and if you're set up and you don't have income coming in, it causes a lot of stress, and then people get into drinking, or they already were drinking, and that leads to something. So there's this whole process. But good for you that you found this program. I also looked at the FBI, I looked at the Border Patrol. They were just launching BORTAC around that time. And so I looked at FBI. One of the disqualifiers for me, unfortunately, at the time was that I didn't have a college degree. So I had gone and then, a few years and had dropped out previously. So you live, you learn. But so tell us more about that process. So obviously you saw the program, you thought it was a fit for you. You applied. Yeah. How long did it take basically until they said, hey, we want to interview you, and then you were accepted basically into the academy?
So it happened a little quicker for me because the FBI has what's called the hostage rescue team, which is kind of their equivalent of a tier 1 unit, right? And so, in fact, they do a lot of rotations with the Army and Navy tier 1 units. And so I certainly wasn't qualified for that, but they have, like the 160th, the FBI also has their own aviation detachment that does nothing but fly the HRT folks. And so the person who was my recruiter was very interested in me coming to assess for that after I'd spent my 2 years as an agent. And so he was able to kind of fast track my application. And every time it got lost, he would call down to the field office and get my interview scheduled or something like that. But even with his help, it's still a long process. Like, I think from the time that I initially submitted my application to I got what's called the call, when you get the call that says you're going to Quantico and here's your class date, was 9 or 10 months. Like, it takes a long time because you have a phase 1, which is a written test that's a couple hours long. And then the phase 2 actually weeds out the majority of the people, and it's an interview. So you fly somewhere and you do a long interview with a couple FBI agents, and then there's a written test, and then you have to do the background check, the polygraph, the PT test, all of that. And so the attrition rate's pretty high in the selection process. And then you get a class date for Quantico. And I can't remember how long it was, maybe 5 or 6 months at the time. And it's still, again, nothing like the attrition rates in like Ranger School or Selection or something like that, but it's still probably between injuries. And at the time, they did stuff in the FBI Academy that you would have never gotten away with in the Army, from the standpoint of they had like lots of shoulder injuries from people doing joint locks wrong, or just things that they would do. Like they used to make you do these push-ups on your knuckles, but in the gravel. And so it would tear your skin up and people would get their knuckles infected, and just like stupid things that the Army, as you know, the Army knows how to make things very physically challenging for you without putting you unnecessarily at risk of getting hurt or something like that. And so I don't know percentage-wise how many folks, I'd say it was probably 10 or 15%, maybe a little higher than that, an attrition rate. And then you get one of those areas that you're tracked. And so mine was counterintelligence, and you're supposed to do that as your job. But when I got to Dallas, I got moved to what was called the Field Intelligence Group. And so it's kind of the intelligence squad that works there. And so your job is to go sort of like what a CIA case officer does, but you do it the CONUS. So instead of, most FBI sources are tied to a specific case. So if you're working a case against a violent gang that sells drugs and stuff, you're trying to recruit sources in that gang or something like that. If you were on the FIG, you had the ability to recruit sources that just answered or had access to more national questions, right? So, you know, whatever's going on overseas that you can imagine, or things like that came out, you had the latitude to just run and recruit sources that didn't have to be tied to cases. And so that was a lot of fun. And I did that for the first part of my tour in Dallas and really liked it. But it was a squad that was supposed to be for more senior agents who had already done investigative or casework, and I hadn't. And so my boss's boss, which is called the ASAC, the Assistant Special Agent in Charge, called me into his office and he said, "You're doing a great job, but you need to go to an investigative squad." And so I thought, well, I'm track counterintelligence, I must be going to the counterintelligence squad. And he said, "Nah, you're going to public corruption." And I absolutely hated that. Like, I felt like I was back sitting, I'd gone from when I was working the intelligence thing, it felt like I was, you know, living a Jack Ryan novel or something like that, to sitting in a cubicle, looking at spreadsheets, analyzing. So I did not, that was kind of my death knell from the FBI. And so fortunately, I had, you know, a buddy that we both know, Nate Self, and then Brandon Cates, who became one of my best friends and is still my best friend to this day. They had started this small veteran-owned company called Previous, and they asked me to come work for them. And so from the FBI till now, when I get to write full time, the companies I worked for, our customers were all folks in the special operations or intelligence communities. And so for me, going back to how do you get that sense of purpose back again, for me, because my customers were the people who were still going into harm's way, who were doing the kind of things I supported back when I was an Apache pilot, I was able to still have that kind of sense of fulfillment and stuff. But it took me a while to figure that out. 2 different career changes, one in corporate America that I started with, another one in the FBI, until I finally kind of found my groove.
Isn't it interesting that a place like the FBI or even a corporation or anywhere like that, like I assume, because I know you, that you were a high performer at whatever agency, and I don't mean just federal, I'm just saying wherever you go. For a leader to, or if it's just the procedures, policies and procedures, that they would just disregard attrition and just say, and it's not somebody acting like a spoiled brat and just saying, well, I don't want to do that. Yeah. But if you have high performers, it's almost like saying, well, because you don't have this, this credential, we're going to move backwards. So it's almost like succession training. Like whenever I'd receive, younger Rangers, typically the idea was like they would read their Ranger handbook and they would learn all the like these basics and memorize all this stuff. But in the op tempo of like GWAT, a lot of that information, I'm not going to say it's useless, but you don't need it on a daily basis. And so I reverse trained everybody. I trained them when they got there, basically like they were senior Rangers. And I just said, like, this is what I need. This is what I require from you, like for my team, or if I was interim mod leader. And so I trained them that way. It's like, well, I need you to be this person. So this is how I'm going to train you. And the rest of this stuff, we can learn that whenever. Yeah. So, but I think it's interesting that person, like you said, you used the expression death nail. It really turned you off. And so it's interesting because you moved on, but you moved on it ended up working out just fine. Yeah. And it ended up working out really well. So I met you in 2015, and we're coming up. I can't even believe it. It's coming up on 10 years since I originally met you. But let's just talk about that a little bit, because I would say you're just a modest, kind of like more quiet guy. And so when I first met you, I got no hint, and you definitely weren't talking about it at the time, that you were into writing or anything. Yeah. I think it's just your personality. I mean, you weren't there yet. You were perfecting your art, and we just met. So it's not like you're going to share the world. But it was a few years later where we met again, and then we realized, oh, wait, we already know each other. And then I was thinking, well, wait a second, man. This is ridiculous, because you are now one of the top authors in the world. I mean, I go to Costco's, I see your books. I see stacks of your books. I go to the airport, I see your name. It's all really cool. And the reason that I can appreciate that is because I come from a creative background before Ranger Regiment. And I love the creative space. I love story writing. I love all that stuff. And so I know how big of a win this is. And so I would just love to hear that part of your life and how the original seed, was it something later where you're like, well, what am I going to do next? I'm going to be a writer? Or was it more like, when you were 5, you used to write great short stories, and then that just grew over the years?
Yeah, almost more the latter. They weren't great short stories, but I always loved telling stories. And I remember my favorite classes in elementary school were when the teacher would give us writing assignments. Now I remember getting in trouble with one of my teachers where she said, you cannot write every story about G.I. Joe. Like, it can't be, you gotta branch out. And so I did, but it took me a long time to be able to get my writing toolkit broad enough or deep enough where I had the tools to be able to tell the kind of stories I wanted to tell that people would pay money for, right? Because that's the hardest part, like you talked about being creative, is that you have to, competition is fierce. And so you have to get really, really good. And so what that looked like for me is, I couldn't tell you how many short stories I've written and how many books that I've written that I never finished. I think I started my first book maybe in middle school, and I didn't know what I was doing and didn't finish it. Tried again in high school, tried again in college, got serious about it maybe in 2001 and took some more classes and finished my first book right before we deployed to Afghanistan, and that didn't sell. And I wrote another book while we were in Afghanistan. We'd come back from missions and everybody else would, play Xbox or whatever. I'd be on my laptop writing, and that didn't sell. And then I took the GI Bill and went back and got a master's in fine arts and writing popular fiction. And during that, your thesis project is a novel. So I wrote a third book, and I thought, surely this is the one. That one didn't sell. So finally, my fourth book, so that was over about 17 years. So from 2001 to when I wrote my fourth book, which ended up being Without Sanction, that did sell, and that came out in 2020, was about 17 years. So Without Sanction came out in 2020, and then my ninth book, which was Capture or Kill, just came out in September. And so it never happened for almost 20 years, and then it happened really fast all of a sudden. And I think that's part of it is certainly me probably getting better as a writer, and then part of it is being in the right place at the right time and having some opportunities like writing for the Tom Clancy universe and now the Vince Flynn one come my way. But to what you were talking about before, and obviously you have a background in writing screenplays and stuff as well, is that I think as a creative, I think too many people try and live off their art too soon. And it's really, really hard to be a writer, or I imagine an actor or singer or anything, when you can't pay the mortgage, right? And so I'm somewhat thankful for some of those earlier failures, because it let me get better at my craft to the point where I went full-time as a writer probably 2.5 or 3 years ago. And I probably would have been tempted to go full-time way sooner than I should have had I had some of that early success.
That's super interesting. And I'm listening to you. We have a lot of similarities. I mean, you and I definitely were in Afghanistan at the similar time. And I was, ironically, I was writing screenplays over there. The same thing as I'd see guys play Xbox and I was writing a screenplay, and then we'd go out on a mission. I'd put a note on my laptop hey, if I don't make it back, send this screenplay to so-and-so or whatever. So I totally relate with it. And that's why I love your story so much, because I really enjoy listening to stories about people winning. I just love, and maybe that just comes because I just haven't been able to crest that hill myself. Yeah. And so I have so much respect for the grind, the creative grind, and just I have love for the game also. Yeah. But I just love to hear about people who have been able to convert. They have that conversion, conversion ratio. And so what? I mean, I know Without Sanction and Matt Drake is your creation. Yeah. You have a lot of love for that, and all of it. So you've written 9 books now.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think you're on your 10th, right?
Yep, that's right.
Okay. I don't know if that was supposed to be released yet or not. But
no, that's fine.
Okay. So, my question is which book, and I don't want you to shoot yourself in the foot here. Which one has been the most fun experience or the most unique experience? Because Matt Drake is obviously your baby. That's yours. And it's okay to say that that's your favorite. I'm just curious to know which one has been most interesting for you for whatever reason.
Yeah, it's kind of like asking a parent, which kid is their favorite. But what I will say, the one that has been most deeply personal to me and has the best ratings on Amazon and stuff like that is my 4th Matt Drake book, which was Forgotten War. And I think part of that, Forgotten War takes place, it's a novel, it's fiction, but it takes place during the fall of Afghanistan. And so a lot of the things referenced in Forgotten War are happened or close to happen. And certainly all the sentiments expressed by the characters in that book did happen, because as we were pulling out of Afghanistan and it was crumbling, I was getting all these texts from veteran friends of mine that had served in Afghanistan or Iraq or both. And they all had kind of a variation of the same question, which was it worth it? Was the the 20 years we spent there, was it, the blood and treasure and the time away from family and the brothers and sisters we lost, was any of that worth it? And I didn't know how to answer that question. And so as a writer, I tried to figure out that answer or come to some sense of it in a book. And so I think it resonates with people who read it, who didn't serve, because it provides, I won't say the viewpoint, because I don't think there's a homogenous viewpoint for all veterans, but maybe the viewpoint of a lot of veterans, at least veteran friends of mine, and certainly a lot of my viewpoints are in it. And so that book, I think, is the most special book to me, just because of the subject matter and how it came about. So,
well, hopefully the Vince Flynn people won't get hurt feelings over that.
No, they're good.
So, Don, just in closing, can you offer any advice for anybody who maybe wants to go down the author path, or
Sure.
is kind of like already in that space?
Yeah, so to be a writer, you got to do two things. You got to read a lot and write a lot. You have to read specifically in the genre that you're trying to write. And so one of my good friends is a guy named Brad Taylor. He was a special forces officer, and then he was a troop and squadron commander in Delta Force. And so he writes a series of books that features this character called Pike Logan, and we write in the same genre. So my books could be shelved in the same area as his, but I'm never going to write a better Brad Taylor book than Brad does. And so if I'm going to write in this genre, I have to read people like Brad, so I know what his customers and hopefully someday my customers expect out of a book that's in this genre. And so you have to become the expert in the genre that you're trying to write in, and you do that by reading. The second thing is you got to write a lot. So like anything else, if you were trying to be a professional golfer and you only practiced your golf swing for 2 hours every Saturday, the odds of you making the PGA Tour are pretty small. And so to be a writer, you got to develop that skill set. You got to develop those writer muscles. Really, the only way to do that is by writing a lot and writing consistently.
Got it. Yeah, it makes sense. And I've heard that from other writers too. So, but listen, man, I could talk for another, hour. I told people in the first episode that I didn't imagine myself, getting into the 2 hour, the 3 hour. I'm still not there yet, but you've been my longest one. And honestly, it's been great. I didn't know a lot of these things about you. And so it's good to learn these things. And I just hope that everybody's able to learn about you. And one more time, just give them I just shared your website again, but just give them any contact information, the Twitter, any type or X, whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is donbentleybooks.com, Bentley. And if you're a social media person, I'm on X, Instagram, and Facebook, and my handle's the same for all three. It's just at Bentley Don B. So BentleyDonB. Always love to hear from folks. So drop me a line.
Awesome, Don. Yeah. So thanks so much for coming on the JC Syndicated Podcast. I really appreciate your time and your story.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me.
All right, Don. Take care.
See ya.
See you, brother.